Fires on ships. Oil exports have been halted. Smolensk, Bryansk, and Kursk are ablaze from strikes. Oil refining stations are burning. Lukoil has been attacked. There is panic in the Moscow region. Airports are paralyzed by the cover plan. And near Novorossiysk, GUR special forces destroyed an expensive Black Sea Fleet ship. Russia is losing its fleet, oil, and airspace all at once. We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome very much.
Thank you. Wishing everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, look, Primorsk has been attacked. Ukraine struck Russia's largest oil terminal port, Primorsk, which handles about 60 million tons of oil annually and brings the Kremlin up to $15 billion. Shipments have been halted. Fires on the vessels. In your opinion, how serious is this blow and how does it affect Russia's economy and its shadow fleet?
Well, finally, we've seen the return of sanctions from the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as the Security Service of Ukraine and the main intelligence directorate. So the SBU carried out an operation on Ust-Luga, and before that, St. Petersburg, so most likely the SBU has taken responsibility for this cluster, the direction towards St. Petersburg. A week or several weeks ago, they struck Ust-Luga. This is also one of the oil and gas terminals. Now they've reached Primorsk as well. So Ust-Luga is south of St. Petersburg and Primorsk is north of St. Petersburg. They've made it there and completed their combat mission, at least halting the technological process of oil transshipment in some respects. This is one of Russia's main ports where the so-called shadow fleet is loaded. It goes through the Baltic, then spreads out all over the world. So instead of relentlessly chasing it across the vast expansive seas and boundless oceans, the most effective and optimal solution is to decisively destroy exactly these crucial kinds of transshipment mechanisms, specifically the transfer of oil through dedicated oil terminals and the direct loading of oil beacons onto large specialized oil carriers, that is to say, massive tankers. There is also the distinct possibility, for example, of striking the entire extensive chain of oil transfer operations, starting from the initial oil extraction process and ultimately ending with Primorsk itself, or any other similar significant terminal such as Novorossiysk, Tuapse, Ust-Luga, or indeed Primorsk. So there is a whole array of these mechanisms here that definitely need to be neutralized, which is exactly what our Ukrainian defense forces are currently doing. Therefore, we can now specifically state that the sanctions of Malyuk, Budanov, Brody, and Madyar are already in effect. If no one stops it like they did last year in May or this year in March, if no one stops it, then these strikes on Russia's oil and gas industry could eventually lead to the following by the end of the year. We've already talked about Nabulina. I feel sorry for the woman, but she'll have no choice but to hang herself because next year she'll have to print rubles, a lot of rubles. And in just a year, the Russian economy will definitely start to collapse, which will eventually lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation itself, just like what happened with the Soviet Union. Roughly for the same reason, the flow of petrodollars dried up.
Roman Grigorievich, so at the same time, oil depots in Smolensk are burning and the Lukoil oil depot is under attack. Ammunition depots in Luhansk are also experiencing massive explosions. There are strikes in Bryansk and Kursk as well. At this point, it looks like a deliberate campaign to destroy energy and military rear infrastructure. What do you think?
It's systematic work, no doubt about it. For a month and a half now, we've been seeing a clear systematic effort to destroy Russian rear positions, and it's being carried out very skillfully at this point. At one point, we criticized all those scattershot drone flights in every direction. They spent almost half a year just using up our drones. Now it's clear they're focusing on specific directions. For example, the security service has taken on the direction towards St. Petersburg, and they keep hitting it and won't stop until they've completely destroyed it. The main intelligence directorate is mainly working toward Crimea and Novorossiysk. So their area of focus is already clear. There's a constant flow of information, and it's already obvious who is responsible for what. Special operations forces, drone system units, and the Ukrainian Air Force are carrying out specific missions against enemy rear areas, reaching as far as the combat radius of their strike capabilities. Our drones can reach 700, even 800 kilometers, basically with ease, which is why places like Syzran, Saratov, and especially closer ones like Rostov or even Volgograd are burning. We have the capability to reach those places. And this systematic work, precise, targeted, methodical, this is what in the army is called doing things with feeling, with sense, with order. This is now clearly evident. The main thing is first, not to stop, and second, to help with quantity. It's very important, extremely important to have a sufficient number of long-range strike capabilities. So a big thank you to Germany. At one time, they paid over 400 million euros for the production of the AN-196 Liuri drones. The Lyuti drones are now striking Russian rear targets one after another. Of course, this is still not enough. After all, the payload that the Lyuti can carry is up to 100 kilograms. Well, usually 50 or 75, depending on the fuel load. So, on the one hand, it's not enough to destroy a serious military facility, but it is enough to set fire to things that are already flammable, like oil refineries or oil pumping stations, for example. By the way, there have been multiple instances of LPDS as well as the 8 and the 7 being destroyed. So that's a minus for the enemy, by the way. Once again, the SBU guys did a great job. Well done, impressive. With these means, it's possible to destroy oil and gas industry facilities specifically, but when it comes to rear facilities or military targets, they definitely need to be destroyed with missiles. To fight against combat units, you need at least half-ton warheads or more. A half-ton, a ton, that's what will penetrate. If it's a half-ton, it should be tandem. A 1-ton warhead can, in principle, be used as a fragmentation high explosive or just high explosive, but the delivery system is important for us. We still don't have enough missiles, and to be honest, apart from announcements, we haven't seen anything concrete regarding missiles yet. We would like to see our ballistic systems in action, and the range for ballistic missiles should be from 500 to 2,500 kilometers. That is, whether it's solid fuel or liquid fuel depends on the range and on the mechanisms for implementing these tasks. So we're waiting. I think that, well, at least by the end of the year, this government, which has been in power for 7 years now, will finally produce something. Well, besides announcements and videos. We've had more than enough of those already.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding Primorsk, this is a key hub for loading the Shadow Fleet, which Russia uses to circumvent international sanctions and sell oil on foreign markets. About 60 million tons of oil pass through the port annually, bringing Russia roughly $15 billion. So the estimated losses to Russia's budget due to SBU attacks right now, if exports are halted, could reach up to $41 million a day. Per day, SBU forces also struck a number of Russian oil pumping stations, specifically NPS-3, the Adriapol NPS, and NPS-7. These are key elements of the main pipeline system that supplies crude oil to the U.S. Luga terminal port. Roman Grigorievich, please comment on this as well.
This is what we were talking about regarding Ust-Luga. There were strikes not only on Ust-Luga itself, but also on the NPS, oil pumping stations, or on LPDS, which are linear production dispatch stations, which through a certain, this is called the Baltic system. There are both the first and the second one there, which handle the pumping for Russia's northern ports. That's why the SBU is now also working systematically, specifically to destroy this particular branch. And the SBU guys should be tipped off that there are 2 more valuable targets like that, also basically in northern Russia, though they're 3,000 kilometers away. But they used to operate a network spanning 7,000 kilometers. They could take care of it. The Yamal Cross. We've talked about this so many times with you. 17 gas pipelines practically converge at a single point there. Several of them run parallel for a few kilometers, and if you can get there even through a network, even through confidants, in the end, you could find our Ukrainians there, since in fact, a large part of our Ukrainians actually built all of this back in the day. There is such an opportunity. It needs to be taken out there, meaning so you don't have to mess around, say, near Petersburg. You should act for this very reason. Then the entire Russian gas system would go down. Most of the gas comes from Yamal, mainly from the Surgut area, from that direction. So if you could get to the Yamal Cross, that would be ideal. And the second thing is the Russian chemical industry. The fact is, a significant portion of Russian gas is processed, and some components are produced, for example, for the same warheads, for the same explosives. Through gas, through ammonia, through ammonium nitrate, they ultimately end up as explosives. Then it's also very important for us to disrupt all these intermediate processes as well. The chemical industry is one thing, but ammonium nitrate warehouses, let's not forget that, first of all, aside from being used as fertilizer, it's also a component for producing explosives and rocket fuel. In other words, the Russians are specifically using it. That's why for us, it's a legitimate military target. Sometimes these warehouses contain anywhere from 10 to 50,000 tons of ammonium nitrate. If you blow them up, believe me, the fireworks will be something else. No one will be left unaffected. Moreover, this ammonium nitrate is also stored in ports. That is, the explosion could simply destroy the entire port if the ammonium nitrate undergoes a certain chemical reaction. Specialists know how to achieve it. In Lebanon, if anyone remembers, just a few years ago, Russian ammonium nitrate, by the way, which had been brought there at one point, exploded and practically wiped out the entire port. So that's how you need to operate. And to the SBU, the main intelligence directorate, and our confidants, we've told those who care so many times, just look around, see what military targets in Russia can burn, set them on fire. Well, set them on fire after all. In the end, this will lead, first of all, to a halt in hostilities, to the restoration of territorial integrity, and ultimately it could bring about the collapse of that prison of nations that is the Russian Federation. Finally, the republics, 21 of them, will set out on their own, become normal countries with their own governments, their own ethnicities, their own histories, and without this oppression from Moscow. Such a possibility exists. And while hostilities continue on the battlefield in Ukraine, if you can help, help.
Roman Grigorievich, the destruction of a ship near Novorossiysk. Let's dedicate the second part of the program to Crimea, Novorossiysk, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The GUR Special Forces destroyed a ship of the MPSV-07 project, one of 4 of its kind in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, worth over $60 million. This is not a random strike, but a targeted elimination of key fleet units. Let's discuss this strike and how seriously the loss of this ship weakens the Black Sea Fleet and its capabilities, and the fact that we are finally striking Novorossiysk.
Well, we need to be, so to speak, precise. It wasn't destroyed, it was damaged. If it had been sunk, then we could say so. And even then, that's not a given. A sunken ship can be raised and restored. If it had been hit in a certain storage area, the so-called powder magazine, then of course it would have blown up and been torn apart, like what happened to the Moskva. But right now it's been damaged. Mainly the deck superstructures were damaged, the so-called radars and the control system. So it's damaged, and at the moment it can't carry out its combat mission. The mechanism of the damage is very interesting. At distances of hundreds of kilometers, drones were carrying out their combat mission under direct control. It was clear that they were under direct operator control, or with machine assistance, so-called machine vision, or with artificial intelligence. In other words, there was definitely some guidance involved because they hit exactly where they needed to on the moving, or rather, as Russians say, the swimming ship. Sailors will know what I mean by that. They hit exactly the right spot. So the means of delivering these drones have already been perfected. Most likely these are BECs, unmanned boats. I call them mini aircraft carriers, which can travel several hundred kilometers one way, strike Russian military targets, and then return for the next batch of drones. That's if we're talking about FPV level drones, for example. But if these are operational level drones, that means they have relay capabilities. By the way, those same BCs can be used as relays to carry out combat missions. Drones that are launched from the mainland with operators located on the mainland as well carry out and complete their combat mission. They finally made it to Novorossiysk. It took a very, very long time, but now we are returning once again to the Novorossiysk base, to the Novorossiysk roadsteads. And we shouldn't forget, it's an entire complex, a whole set of maritime structures and sea terminals. Right there is the significant Novorossiysk port, which is primarily used for the transshipment of crude oil, various oil products, including light petroleum products and other valuable commodities. So we need to take out the oil boys, not allow the Russians to earn money not only through Primorsk or Ust-Luga, but also through the Tuapse and Novorossiysk ports. But I think the specialists know, the main intelligence directorate understands this issue perfectly, and this direction in the near future will be on fire, just like the SBU is currently working on Ust-Luga and Primorsk and on St. Petersburg.
Roman Grigorievich, how do you assess our work in the occupied Crimea, the strikes, the work of the main intelligence directorate, the armed forces of Ukraine, the military attacks?
Well, preparations have been underway for a month and a half already. Most likely this is preparation for a serious attack, either by air or by missile, because mainly radars and control systems of the radio technical troops of the Russian Federation are being destroyed. RTV is one of the main components of the air defense system and in general the defense of Crimea. Crimea is very difficult to defend, especially from the air, because after we drove the Russian ships away from Crimea, attacks from the sea are now possible in principle by any means. Drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, aircraft, so there are various ways to approach and carry out a combat mission, which is exactly what is happening now. The main intelligence directorate is primarily at work. Our naval forces are involved, special operations forces, sometimes the security service of Ukraine as well. That is, they also carry out missions in this direction, although most likely they are still focused on the northern direction. That's the right approach too. Sometimes diversion, so-called echeloning, either by altitude or by direction, works quite well and yields good results. And lately we can talk about dozens of Russian radar stations being taken out, both in Crimea and in the direction toward Crimea, that is along the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia fronts. And again, this all shows the systematic work of our special services. And now unmanned systems forces have started to be involved at the operational level there as well.
Roman Grigorievich, what about the report and the cover plan and the paralyzed Russian aviation industry? Hundreds of flights have been cancelled and delayed at Pulkovo, and the Cover Plan is in effect. In Moscow and the Moscow region, this is essentially paralyzing aviation. From the perspective of actually paralyzing Russia's civil aviation, how important is this in terms of undermining the Russian economy?
Well, the paralysis of aviation seriously impacts the economy. And it's not just about the financial aspect, there's also the so-called time factor. It's one thing to rattle along on a train for several weeks, say to Vladivostok or, for example, to Beijing, and quite another to fly there in 10 to 15 hours, depending on the number of layovers. That's a completely different story. Naturally, all of this adds up, or rather leads to a certain result, either positive or negative. That's why these kinds of strikes, well, for now, at this moment, are of course indirect. In other words, our goal right now isn't to ground Russian aviation. The focus is on carrying out combat missions and destroying military targets. And as a side effect, so to speak, the Russians are trying to manage all this through the carpet plan, fully aware that our combat drones could collide with Russian civilian aircraft in the air. And so they simply activate the carpet plan because no air traffic controller or flight director will take responsibility for allowing civilian aircraft to take off or land if there is an unidentified flying object present. That is essentially what the carpet plan is, as they call it. In other words, this is a significant side effect, so to speak, of carrying out a combat mission. Well, it still undeniably brings certain negative, rather detrimental consequences for the Russian economy, causing considerable impact. For us, of course, the more problems the Russian economy has, the better it is for us. So this kind of tandem, you could say, strike while carrying out a combat mission is in principle positive for us.
Roman Grigorievich, meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense has reported shooting down all 221 drones over the territories of Bryansk, Smolensk, Leningrad, Kaluga, Moscow, Novgorod, Oryol, Belgorod, Rostov, Tver, Pskov, Tula, and Kursk regions. What do you say to that?
Well, then let them go get a banana from the fridge or grab a candy from the table, since they're such heroes, so great, and manage to shoot everything down. Then what's burning in Ust-Luga, in Primorsk, in Saratov, in Syzran, and so on? That's not just happening for no reason, probably spontaneous combustion, you could say. They smoked where they shouldn't have, and where they should have, they didn't really smoke. Let them finish their smoke. Because it's clear this was a massive attack. Several hundred of our drones, and about half of them, well, that's standard by the coefficient, half were decoys meant to draw the enemy's air defenses. That's their job. We also have a lot of flying boards that cost $200, but they draw out a Russian missile, which can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, or force the Russians to deploy helicopters and planes, using up their aviation resources for a large-scale attack. This is our response for our Polish brothers. Well, we showed the Russians, don't mess with our people. It's better not to mess with our people, otherwise you'll keep running into problems like this, and not just once. This kind of European unity should be cultivated at the very least, and we expect the same attitude from our partners.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding another important topic, military exercises. Today, Russian-Belarusian military exercises called Zapad 2025 are starting in Belarus. The exercises will last until September 16th and will take place at training grounds in Belarus and Russia, according to Belta. The media claim that their goal is to practice modern and joint actions of Belarusian and Russian troops within the framework of ensuring the military security of the Union state and readiness to repel possible aggression. That's a quote. Is there any real threat, Roman Grigorievich? Because as I understand it, Poland has closed the border and Poland is already concerned about these exercises. What do you think?
Well, they're right to prepare for the worst. It's just that it won't happen because there are no combat units there. Well, there are several tens of thousands, about 20 to 25,000 Russian Belarusian soldiers. Most of them, well, the majority of them have never seen combat, meaning they've never been under fire. So they definitely don't pose any threat in terms of large-scale offensive operation. Well, the military always prepares for the worst, so it's right that the Poles have deployed 40,000 troops along the borderline, closed the border, and that's basically the main thing is that they don't open it. It needs to be sealed up and forgotten about, as they say. That's when there will be a real effect, by the way, including an economic one. And a military effect as well, because it's much easier to guard a border that no one is sneaking across. And if someone does sneak across, you need to get them in your sights and carry out your combat mission. That's basically it. That's what the Poles are ready for now. But really, judging by the number of forces and resources allocated for these exercises, this isn't a combat unit in terms of carrying out a mission, but they can create certain provocations, for example, at the same level as the recent drone incursion into Poland. Provocations using aerial means of attack, mainly aviation related. So these could be either drones or cruise missiles or planes and helicopters, like when the Mi-8 helicopter entered Estonian airspace for 4 minutes. So in the near future, they might send in pairs or maybe just one at a time, helicopters, planes into the airspace of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. But all this is happening near the so-called border conflict without crossing the line of what's allowed. They've already more or less figured out where they'll start getting shot down. And that's why in this zone, about 10 to 15 kilometers, they might hover around, but nothing more than that. So most likely the Russians, together with the Belarusians, won't be capable of anything more than that at the moment. As for the issues they'll be addressing during these exercises, well, the only, let's say, reasonable action would be if the Russians teach the Belarusians how to sort the remains of the destroyed Russian army into body bags, if the Belarusians take part, that is. Sometimes you get 3 legs in a bag or 4 arms, 6 eyes, so these 6-legged, 7 whatever creatures sometimes end up being buried in Russia. So you need to be careful with that. I think that's actually the main point here. Russian troops will be sharing with Belarusian troops. Let them get ready to properly sort body parts into bags.
Roman Grigorievich, after the attack on Poland, after that an investigation came out showing that in fact the drones were headed for Russian military facilities in Poland. This was deliberate. Polish SIM cards had been purchased. This had been in preparation since the summer of 2025. And after that, a huge number of reputable European and American media outlets published articles saying that Poland demonstrated a very low rate of drone interception, that Poland has major problems, and that if there is a large-scale war, if Russia attacks NATO countries, the Poles will face enormous difficulties. Moreover, they were shooting down cheap Russian drones with very expensive military equipment, the costs of which are simply incomparable. And then analysts come to the conclusion that, in principle, since Russia saw that there was no reaction to its strike on Poland, that is, NATO decided that this was not a threat at all and that it was not worth responding, Russia will continue to try attacking with missiles, and in the future, the attacks could become much more serious, up to and including an invasion of European countries, NATO member states. What do you think?
Well, that's a nice fairy tale. Why? Let me explain. If right now, just imagine the Russians, say, rode into some Polish voivodeship on machine gun mounted carts, right? Could they have managed to break in? Yes, of course they could. On horses, on carts with machine guns, with bows and arrows, with whatever, with some other weapons from the last millennium. The Poles, if, well, maybe they wouldn't have stopped them right away, of course. And then someone would have had a complaint against the Poles. They just can't fight against horses. But why even do that? Why, for example, create a serious system to counter a Russian invasion of that level when there are much more effective means? But if you're running somewhere with bows and arrows, well, in the end, eventually there are machine guns. If you're running somewhere with machine guns, there's aviation. Even if you advance somewhere with aviation, or say with drones, with an air component, well, there are missiles too. If there is serious pressure toward Poland, the Poles should just simply cover Moscow with ballistic and cruise missiles from their air force. Why bother fighting with these bows, arrows, and drones? The strike should hit directly at the heart of Russia, that is Moscow, targeting Moscow, the Kremlin, and the Rubliov Kabats. We've talked about where decisions are made, so that's where it should go. And if that is until Europe reaches this level of decision making, and only this way can you ensure security from bows, arrows, say some boomerangs or whatever else. But there are more effective ways to stop the enemy and not head on. Why go head on? Hit them from behind, after all. You should strike from behind, not head on. Why confront them head on? And that's why we're now expecting this kind of action from the Europeans finally. Moreover, you don't have to do it yourself. Just give us the means of destruction and we'll take care of it ourselves. No problem. Tomahawks or say those same Taurus missiles. We could hit Moscow in a heartbeat, 1, 2, 3, on behalf of the Poles, the Europeans, anyone at all. We can do it, and then believe me, not a single drone, not a single arrow, not a single sideways glance toward Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, or Poland will come from Belarus or Russia, once they clearly understand that even a sideways glance toward the West will immediately bring, say, a dozen missiles into the Kremlin or military targets in Kapotnia, or military sites in and around Moscow. So that's how we need to act and prepare for what? For the conduct of military operations from the last millennium? Why? Why build some kind of grand, elaborate defensive structures just to hold back some hypothetical, potentially aggressive Russian army that might someday deploy somewhere? Instead, strike Moscow right away. Hit those same crucial Ural factories, specifically Uralvagonzavod, the significant Yamal Cross, and the vital Omsk oil refinery. There are key strategic points like these, hundreds of them in fact, that Europe can easily reach with its advanced missile and air capabilities. Press any of them and Russia will shut down instantly, like the lights going out in a bathhouse, and those sideways glances toward the west will disappear. Europe has these means and they have 3 to 4 times more aircraft than the Russians, not to mention missiles of various types and so on. These are what you call capabilities. So on the one hand, yes, against drones, against bows and arrows, against cavalry, against machine gun carts, maybe at the moment Europe doesn't have that kind of resistance on the ground, but I'll say it again, it's not necessary. What matters here is to make the decision to strike directly at the decision-making center, and then there won't be any problem.
Roman Grigorievich, to sum up your conclusions regarding the outcome of the latest Ramstein meeting that took place this week?
Excellent. By the way, this last Ramstein meeting gave us a lot, at least in terms of planning our capabilities until the end of the year for conducting military operations, and in some areas not only from a defensive standpoint, but also offensively. That is, a fairly large amount of equipment will be transferred, as well as ammunition and air defense systems, of course, which can be used not only defensively, but also offensively, including 2 Patriot systems, parts of which can be used as offensive weapons. That is, for example, there is solid funding from our Scandinavian countries, both Finland and Sweden, and Norway has also confirmed, including everything from archers to long-range strike systems. Some assets will definitely be transferred that will be used by our Air Force. So in the end, we are waiting for the deployment of those 2 brigades, which I think will be formed by the end of the year. 2 brigades of F-16S and Mirages, which will be able to carry out offensive operations even along the current front line. There simply aren't enough planes there yet, but I think they will arrive soon, and we will finally see the performance of that air component we've been talking about for at least several years. In other words, we absolutely need it. And it will undoubtedly be the significant culmination of the upcoming summer military campaign of 2025, which could potentially bring the Russians a considerable amount of unexpected surprises and strategic challenges.
Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine and the courage of Ukrainians. Roman Hryhorovich and I are working for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you very much. And as always, see you this Monday.
Goodbye.